tied to the value of what rents on land were back in 1914 before all the trouble started. And we, the German government, promised that we won't inflate this currency at all. And if only you believe that it's not going to increase over time, it won't. And so they did that. And lo and behold, it was true. The hyperinflation stopped. And as Tom Sargent at New York University pointed out in a very nice article I read when I was a graduate student called The End of Four Big Inflations, the German government actually printed more money after the Rentenmark came in than it had before. The reason it did was that back before the end of the hyperinflation, almost nobody wanted to have any money because you hold money, its value melts away in your pocket within a week. And afterwards, once people thought the inflation would stop, people were very happy to hold money. Right? It's not losing its value over time. It's very convenient to hold because you can buy stuff for it. And so the end of the German hyperinflation in 1923-24 came about not because the German government stopped printing money, but instead simply because it changed its standard, changed what it called the currency, kept printing money at its previous pace, and people believed that things are going to be different. Why people should believe that things are going to be different is an interesting question, and the domain perhaps more of the psychologist than the political economist. But it does happen. And acting directly on, or acting through your jawbone on expectations of inflation is possible and can be effective. All right, so there we have our tool, right, this Phillips curve. It says that inflation depends on what people expect inflation to be and also on the rate of unemployment. That when the unemployment rate's high, inflation will be low. When the unemployment's low, inflation will be high. Inflation will be above expectations. Here's the picture of inflation and unemployment in the United States since 1950. With each month's indication of what inflation is and what unemployment was in the previous past year being a little diamond. And you look at this, and it looks to me like an enormous mess. How are you supposed to make sense out of this? You start, say, a year or so before the Korean War, and you end the last month's data is way down here or so. And then it's come back. So I think this is the last point on this data set. Since then, we've come back to here or so. This is what's happened to inflation and unemployment in the United States since 1960. How can we make sense of this in light of our little Phillips curve model? Well, we can start by simply looking at the 1960s. Right? Here are all the data points for the 1960s. Here are all the data points up through the end of Richard Nixon's first year as president. And there are some times when inflation's low and unemployment's low. There's some times when it seems to be that even though inflation's very low, unemployment's high. But for the most part, you can see a clear and strong downward relationship here. And you can look at this, and you can say, it really looks, kind of looking at the economy's center of gravity, like the natural rate of inflation is something like 2%, and the expected rate of inflation is something like 2%, and the natural rate of unemployment is something like 5.5%, or maybe expected inflation was a bit lower than 2%. But that here is kind of where the natural rate of unemployment and the expected rate of inflation are. And then you have these years in the late 1960s when times are good in the sense that unemployment is low, is below the economy's natural rate of unemployment. Lots of people have jobs, but you pay a price for this because you have higher inflation. And so they say in 1967, 68, and 69, especially in the Vietnam War, because the government's demand for extra goods and services has pushed unemployment down, you have higher inflation. That each year people say, the labor market's tight, I can ask for more wage increases, and the product market's tight, I can charge higher margins. And those things push inflation up above the value that people generally expect it to be in the late 1960s. But you don't have any big changes in expectations of inflation. That even near the end of the 1960s, people are still expecting inflation to come back to its normal level of 2%, 2.5% per year or so. That's the history of inflation and unemployment in the 1960s. And when Richard Nixon takes office, his economic advisors, chiefly Herbert Stein and Alan Greenspan, tell him we're going to have to let the unemployment rate go back up to something like 6% or so if we want to get inflation under control. Right? If not, if we keep running the economy with the unemployment rate at 4%, sooner or later people will stop expecting 2% inflation. Sooner or later people will see that if inflation's 6% year after year after year, they'll no longer expect it to be 2%. And when they stop expecting 2% inflation, we're going to see this kind of nice situation break down. We're going to see inflation expectations rise. And that fraction of economists led by Milton Friedman was totally right. Things start out relatively well in the 1970s, at least for Richard Nixon's economic advisors. That they let the Federal Reserve shrink or reduce the rate of growth of the money stock and raise interest rates. They start pulling U.S. troops out of Vietnam and cutting back on defense spending. And sure enough, from 1970 on up to 1972 or 3 or so, the economy moves back down around a Phillips curve. It's not quite the same Phillips curve that we saw in the 1960s. Right? That instead of touching the 2% line for an unemployment rate of 5.8% or so, you get the 2% unemployment only with an unemployment rate of 6.7% or so. That it would probably be better to say that inflation expectations are 3 to 4% per year rather than 2 to 3%. But things seem to be going reasonably well on the inflation control front as the unemployment rate rises back to 6%. And it's at this point, I think, that the consensus is that Richard Nixon's desire to get reelected enters the story. You see, Nixon had been Dwight Eisenhower's vice president in the 1950s. And Nixon was an extremely unusual politician. You can see his portrait in the Institute for Governmental Studies, I think in the basement of Moses Hall, as one of the 3 presidents to come from California, Hoover, Nixon, and Reagan. And Nixon was a distinctly odd bird. Although he'd been Eisenhower's vice president for 8 years, Eisenhower didn't like him very much. Eisenhower would end press conferences when people asked, well, what important decisions of the administration has Richard Nixon played a significant role in? And Eisenhower would say things like, well, if you give me a week, I might be able to think of one. Ask me that question next week. And Richard Nixon deeply believed in the political business cycle. That is, he believed that if the party in power was trying to win re-election with a high unemployment rate, it was like things were likely to go very badly. And come February of 1960, Richard Nixon and his friend Arthur Burns had gone to Dwight Eisenhower and Eisenhower's cabinet and said, hey, it looks like we're having a small recession right now. I don't want the economy to be in recession on November 1960 when election day comes around because I'm your vice president, I'm running to be the next president. Will you, Eisenhower, please do something? Ask the Federal Reserve to lower interest rates, propose a budget that spends more money. Will you do something with expansionary and fiscal or monetary policy to boost the rate of growth of the economy so I don't have to run against John F. Kennedy in September and October with Kennedy saying the Republicans have done a horrible job at the economy. Look, the unemployment rate's up at 6%. You shouldn't let them continue in office. And Eisenhower says no. Eisenhower says he's not in the business of manipulating economic policy for short-term political advantage, even for his own vice president, to a favor for his own vice president. And sure enough, Richard Nixon loses the 1960 presidential election to John F. Kennedy by the very narrowest of margins. And if you read Nixon's autobiography, Six Crises, he's very much unashamed about how if only he and Burns had managed to get Eisenhower to do something, he would have become president. He would have won the election of 1960. Now it's 1971, and indeed inflation's coming down, but the unemployment rate's back at 6% or so. And so who does Richard Nixon take and nominate to be chairman of the Federal Reserve Board? Arthur Burns. What does Arthur Burns do? The economy tends to do things like this under Arthur Burns' tenure. That the unemployment rate starts to fall and fall fairly rapidly. And when the unemployment rate falls near to 5%, everything breaks down. Expectations of inflation start to take off. People say in the 1960s we were fooled. We didn't understand that the government was following policies that would push the unemployment rate down and produce higher inflation. Now we do. We're not going to get caught out by this. We're going to raise our expectations of inflation as fast as the government can pursue stimulative policies to reduce the unemployment rate. To which you then have added the 1973 tripling of world oil prices, which also makes everyone think everything's going to be more expensive in the future than in the past, and raises everyone else's expectations of inflation. So by say the late by late 1973, the economy is up here with 10% inflation and 5% unemployment. This goes into 1974, and Gerald Ford replaces Nixon, who resigns in disgrace after having been caught trying to bug his political opponents at the Watergate Hotel, as well as having asked people to do other things, like having demanded that his chief of staff, H.R. Haldeman, find some people to throw firebombs into the Brookings Institution, the Democratic think tank at 1775 Massachusetts Avenue in Washington, D.C., but to do so only after they'd gone in and cleaned out the safe of interesting documents, and then also to plant evidence saying that the left had done it. Fortunately for all of us, H.R. Haldeman ignored him, but that's really not the kind of person you want to have as president. Nixon gets pushed out, told that either he needs to resign or be impeached. Gerald Ford takes over. Gerald Ford economic advisors say that, yes, high inflation is our big problem, and you need to do something about it. And so Gerald Ford tells the Federal Reserve Board that he wants it very much to reduce unemployment, to reduce inflation, and starts wearing buttons saying win on them. Whip inflation now. Distributes them to his cabinet and his sub-cabinet and says an anti-inflation consciousness is the right thing for the United States government to do. But you then get a big recession, and the inflation rate falls, but the inflation rate falls only back to 6% or so. At which point the Carter administration takes office because Jimmy Carter runs against Gerald Ford for presidency on two major planks. The first was that Gerald Ford was picked by a liar to be his vice president, whereas Carter says, by contrast, I'll never lie to you. And the second because the misery index in the United States, the sum of the inflation and unemployment rate, is at sky-high levels, so that the Republicans have clearly mismanaged the economy. Carter becomes president, and Carter's economic policy team says we're going to pursue a policy of gradualism. We're going to try to recover from the 1975 recession, but we're going to do so slowly so that we don't destabilize people's expectations. And in fact, people become aware that we're not the old team that was interested in boosting the economy and didn't care about inflation, that all we wanted was a low unemployment rate when our president ran for re-election. And as people realize that we're following sober policies, expectations of inflation will drop. And we'll move back from this orangish Phillips curve that the United States was in the mid-1970s, where people were expecting inflation of 8% or so, back down to our more normal Phillips curve. And they were wrong. They were completely 100% wrong, especially after the additional tripling of world oil prices because of the Iranian Revolution. People didn't trust the Carter administration at all. And so come 1979, the United States is stuck with unemployment about at its natural rate of 5% or so, about at the level at which there's neither upward nor downward pressure on inflation from unemployment, but an inflation rate up at 12%. At which point, Jimmy Carter names Paul Volcker to head the Federal Reserve, and Paul Volcker says this has got to stop. We've gotten ourselves into a situation where not only are expectations of inflation high, but expectations of inflation are increasing. If people were expecting 4% inflation in the early 1970s and expecting 8% inflation in the mid-1970s, they're expecting 11% inflation now, and will expect 15% inflation come the mid-1980s unless I do something. Which that's the point that Paul Volcker assembles the rest of the Federal Reserve behind him and says we're just going to hit the economy on the head with a brick. We're going to push unemployment up high, above 10%, and we're going to keep it there until we think that people know that we're serious about fighting inflation, that we won't let the unemployment rate fall, we won't reduce interest rates to let people put Americans back to work, until we see signs that Americans no longer expect 10% inflation. Now, in the end, Paul Volcker actually had to call a halt to his policy prematurely. That he wanted to stick up here for a while. But the fact that one side effect of the policy was to bankrupt Mexico and start the lost decade in the 1980s in Latin America led him to start reducing interest rates and allowing the unemployment rate to fall and GDP to grow again before he'd gotten to the 2 or 4% inflation rate that he wanted to see. But it is the case that during the initial stages of the Volcker disinflation, the economy moves back along its early 1980s Phillips curve. That unemployment and inflation falls, but only because Volcker has hit the economy on the head with a brick, and there are lots of unemployed workers out there willing to take jobs and to undercut those who currently have them. And then as inflation expectations fall, Paul Volcker allows the unemployment rate to fall, until by the 1987, when he leaves office or so, the inflation rate is 3.5%, and the unemployment rate is up at 6.5% or so. And it's at that point that Alan Greenspan takes over as chairman of the Federal Reserve. And Greenspan says, there's been the stock market crash, maybe there's a depression threatening. I'm going to let inflation fall, or unemployment fall faster than Volcker did and see what happens. And indeed, he lets inflation fall faster than Volcker did, and the unemployment fall faster than Volcker did, and the inflation rate rises back towards 6% at the very end of the 1980s, which is... Then Greenspan reverses course, and he raises interest rates and he pushes the unemployment rate up high again. In the process, he manages to deprive George H.W. Bush of his second term as president. A thing for which the Bush family has never forgiven Alan Greenspan. That before the current wave of people who didn't especially like Alan Greenspan for his failure to handle the subprime mortgage crisis, Greenspan had only one set of enemies, and it was the Bush family and their political allies. Really quite extraordinary. But Greenspan's policies of saying, let's reverse our course and let unemployment rise a little bit and see if that affects inflation expectations, did indeed work. In the early 1990s, inflation expectations are relatively stable as unemployment rises, inflation falls. And then once Alan Greenspan has gotten everyone's attention with the fact that the unemployment rate is now above the natural rate, he finds he can let the unemployment rate fall gradually as inflation expectations fall. And by the end of the 1990s, we're back to essentially to where we were at the start of the 1960s, with once again everyone expecting low inflation around 2% or so. And with this potential Phillips curve relationship, that when unemployment is low, inflation will be higher than expected. When unemployment is high, inflation will be lower than expected. And the economy kind of looked set in 2000 to move back and forth, more or less along that particular curve. That's how things stood at the end of the past decade. Now we go to the 2000s. And during the 2000s, it kind of works until you hit 2008 or so. That is, throughout Alan Greenspan's and then Ben Bernanke's tenure as chairman of the Federal Reserve, there are years when the unemployment rate is low and when inflation is higher than 2%. When the unemployment rate goes up, inflation falls below 2%. It moves back and forth. And then come 2008, the unemployment rate starts to rise like a rocket. So far that by now you'd expect the inflation rate to be minus 2% or so in the United States, if you were still moving along this particular Phillips curve. But we're not there. We're still stuck here with inflation of maybe 1%, 1.5%, and unemployment above 9% or so. Why is this the case? Is it the case that people now expect inflation to be 4%? No, what seems to happen is that this Phillips curve relationship breaks down when the rate of inflation gets very, very low indeed. Right? That this Phillips curve is linear. This Phillips curve says that no matter what the level of expected inflation is, each additional percentage point of unemployment has the same effect on the inflation rate as any other. That if expected inflation is 10%, if you push unemployment up 2 percentage points above the natural rate, you can push it down to 9%, and if inflation is 0, by boosting unemployment by 2 percentage points, you can push it down to minus 1%. That really doesn't seem to be true. And the best hypothesis I've heard for why it isn't true comes from Yale economist Truman Bewley, which is that people are unhappy if their wage increases don't keep up with the rate of inflation. If inflation is 4% and you get an only 1% wage increase, you're unhappy. But if inflation is 1% and they cut your wages by 2%, you're not just unhappy, you're enraged. You're absolutely furious. You've been personally dissed. Right? There's something about cutting the number of dollars that you're going to be paid for doing the same work in the American psyche that gets people really angry, and it makes them really unwilling to put in the effort to be good workers. And so Truman Bewley argues it's the fact that companies know that cutting people's wages is a way to guarantee that they'll do a lousy job, whatever their job is, means that businesses are overwhelmingly unwilling to cut people's wages at all. They'll fire a lot of people before they'll actually cut anyone's wages. And that means that this Phillips curve model breaks down whenever you get into situations like we are today, where the inflation rate is very, very low. And that explanation seems to me to be highly likely to be true. And it's something that tells us that the general Phillips curve model for inflation economics, while it's very useful, while it's very useful in understanding what happened in the 1960s, as you have this back and forth movement along the Phillips curve as inflation expectations don't change. In the 1970s, in where you have some big upward shifts in expected inflation, and aside from that, where you can see the economy responding to higher unemployment with lower. To the 1980s, where you have a backward shift of the Phillips curve back to a more normal position, as fears that every decade would be like the 1970s and have high and rising inflation ebb, and then into the 1990s with additional reduction in inflation expectations. Come the 2000s, come the late 2000s, the model simply breaks down and is no longer terribly useful. But we think we won't always stay at unemployment of 8.9% or higher. Things will get better. And when we get back to a more normal unemployment rate, we expect the Phillips curve relationship, the expectational Phillips curve relationship, to emerge itself once again. So with that, I'd like to ask, what you think about the Phillips curve. What should we think about it as an economic relationship?